Beginner's Guide to Wrangling Asynchronicity in JavaScript. Took me about 10 minutes to spell that correctly. Also, a plea that I've been asking myself for about 30 years or so of working with computers is just why can't things be a little bit easier? I am Raymond Camden. I am a developer evangelist for Adobe. I'm actually giving a talk later about our super exciting PDF services. Calm down. I know I said PDF. I know that excites you. Calm down. I'm talking about that later today. Please come see the exciting PDF API stuff I have to show. But I blog at Raymond Camden and I tweet at Raymond Camden. My DMs are open. I love questions because I can turn those into blog posts, presentations. If you have any questions about what I'm talking about today or anything else, please give me a follow and reach out. If you don't want to follow me, I have a bot that does random cat pictures and a bot that does random Taylor Swift quotes. So you're welcome to follow either of those as well. So a little bit more about myself. I have been okay at JavaScript for a very, very, very long time. I keep thinking next year I'll be really good. And then next year comes and they add more crap to it. And I'm like, crap, I gotta learn something else now. So I'm back to being okay to like middling well. My JavaScript resume contains the fact that I wrote code for Netscape.com. Now, for those of you who are younger, that was the shit back in the day. Like they were the bomb. The work for them was incredible. But that was a long, long time ago. Now I'm at the point where sometimes I remember which array methods mutate the array versus returning a new array. Am I the only one who has trouble with that? Please. I never remember. Thank God for MDN. And I could proudly say I almost use reduce, almost, without having to check the docs on how to use it. When I built this slide deck originally, this was about 8 or so months ago. I've given this talk one last time. I wrote the slide deck, and like a week later, I did it. And I was like, oh my God, I wrote the code and it actually worked, and I'm pretty sure it's the right value. And I was incredibly proud of myself. And then like last week, I tried again, and I just failed. So I went back to the docs and had to do it a couple times. Also, I'm not looking for a job, but if you're hiring and you love to give coding tests, you should definitely come to me. I am excellent at failing coding tests. You get me in an interview, I can barely remember the math operator, the addition operator. I forget everything. I'd be happy to tell you about my experiences interviewing for a certain search company and my many thoughts on that process. All right, so today's discussion, I'm going to talk about the particular problem, the problem being asynchronicity. I'm going to talk about the types of solutions that we have out there, and then we're going to iterate getting more and more advanced. If this is not clear, this is definitely a beginner's JavaScript course. If you're an expert at JavaScript, feel free to critique me on Twitter and talk about my awesome shirt. That's totally fine. But the expectation is that you are kind of new and are kind of trying to figure things out. Also, this slide deck is all up on my GitHub repo if you want that. If you don't have time to copy that, just see me later. So the problem, and is that big enough? Thumbs up in the back or thumbs down? So-so? All right. I do not mind. Oh, that did nothing. That's awesome. All right. Let cats equals get cats. You call some function and then you work with the cats. And then the typical response to this is undefined. Now, those of us who know JavaScript and you're just here to mock me, which is fine, you already know what the problem is. But if you are new to development, new to JavaScript, this can be very, very confusing. Your expectation was that I called some function, I know it's going to return me some data, so why is that not working? And the reason it's not working is because that particular function needed to take an undefined or certain amount of time to get crap done. I had to make a network call. I had to loop over so many records. It just had to do stuff. And that it did not return an immediate response, but I expected it to do so. To be fair, it's kind of easy to trick yourself into not knowing this. Anybody here use jQuery? Yeah, that number's getting smaller and smaller every year. So jQuery was an amazing tool. It made things so much easier in JavaScript. And this is a simple example where I needed functionality on my web page to get the weather and display it in the DOM. And the way that jQuery made this easy, it provided a simple function called Ajax. I gave it a URL, I passed my data, and I said what to do when done. The fact that this is all kind of asynchronous, that's kind of hidden. And if you, Lord forbid, copy and paste some code that worked into your, into your work, which I have done for 25 years, you may miss the fact about what's actually kind of happening behind the scenes, what jQuery is hiding and making simpler for you. This could come up if you decide, well, you know what, that particular call runs a little bit slow, and I get like a white page when the user hits that. I want to tell them something is going on, so I'll use more jQuery methods to put a loading method in. Then I'll call my function, and then I will render the HTML. You may expect this to work just fine. Unfortunately, it's not going to work because that success function is only going to fire when that particular network call is done. So again, this is, when I say you may not understand that, that's absolutely not an attack. This is definitely not obvious when you start development, when you start working with an environment that can do things in an asynchronous manner. So the first solution, kind of the common way that we saw of working with stuff like this was with callbacks. So callbacks took this idea of, you're going to call my API, you're going to pass me some arguments so I know how to do whatever you're doing, get the weather, get the cats, etc. And then the last argument that you're going to pass me is the function that I want to run when something is done. So that could look something like this. I'm calling some API, I'm passing an argument, 90210, I'm passing another argument, 7-day, and then I'm passing the last argument as basically, what to do when done. And what was decided amongst the internet gods, people smarter than me, is that the typical pattern for a callback would be a function where if there's an error, it's the first argument, and if everything worked okay, the second argument would be whatever your result is. So pretty much nearly every callback-driven system looked a bit like this. And this kind of makes sense a little bit. I can understand that, I know the code that's going to work when things are done. I know where my arguments go. I get maybe a tiny bit of a code smell. And code smells is a fancy way of saying your spidey sense is tingling that maybe this may not scale perfectly well. If I start adding more and more arguments, I got to make sure my callback's always the last argument. If I'm actually building some API, I got to make sure I kind of keep that metaphor of, I need to add a couple more arguments to my logic, but callback always has to be the end. I may be a little bit worried about that, but that's the next developer's problem, not mine. So this is probably going to be too small. How is this? Yeah, all right. So I have written a function called getCats. It takes one argument, the breed, and then a callback function to run when done. So all I've done is call that, getCats, I passed my argument, and then I passed in the logic to run when done. And you could see here at the bottom, and this got bigger, but that's still a little bit small. But you see I did get a result. I got 2 cats. And I'm kind of faking a asynchronous process by using a set timeout. That way I can kind of simulate saying time. If we reload this, we should see 2 seconds pass, and I get my data. All right, so as long as we don't change anything else ever, we're completely done with the presentation. Thank you for showing up. Nothing ever gets more complex in code, right? It always gets simpler. Isn't that how it typically goes? Probably, sometimes. What if, oh God, I got to do 2 things. That's crazy. Doing 2 things on a web page, it'll slow down. It's too much to do. Or I need to do 2 things where the first thing has to finish first. Maybe I need the result of that first thing to pass to a second call. Or maybe I don't. Maybe I want to do two things, and I want to use the amazing power of my laptop to do two things at once. And I want to know when both of those things are done. So you may get a little bit fancy. So I will call a function called getCats. I'll pass in an argument. I'll pass a callback function. And then inside of that, I will take the result, and I'll call another asynchronous function. This time it's called getDogs. And then at the end of that, inside that callback function, I can work with cats, I can work with dogs, and everything is hunky-dory. No problem, right? There's no way this could possibly lead me astray. Correct? Possibly. If I show you an example of this, and hopefully the font size stays big, that's still okay for y'all back there? All right, I have my getCats, I have my getDogs, and I could see I call one, I call the other, and then when I am done, I can work with the result. So 2 calls is not too bad. So far, so good. All right. I may get a little clever. I have been known to be clever sometimes. Typically, that's when I make some of the worst mistakes in my programming life, but every now and then I'm clever and it works out. So instead of doing a callback inside a callback, what I may do is call both functions, getCats and getDogs, and getCats will say, hey, is the dog function done? Because I'm done. If dog's done, then we're all done. And the dog function will say, hey, I'm going to run something, and if I'm done, and then if cats are done, then we're all done. And this way, instead of having a callback and a callback, which means dogs has to wait for cats, I could use the amazing power of my laptop to do two things at once, and then just use some flags to remember, is the other guy done? Am I done? Then yes, we can continue. And this works excellent. You can see the result down here. This is the perfect solution, except until I need 4 things. And to be clear, that solution that I just showed of multiple flags, I have done that with 4 things. I'm not ashamed to say it because I knew it worked. I made a bunch of variables and the code shipped, and I was okay with that. And I know I'm not the only person who has written code that you're a bit embarrassed about, but it works. And you just kind of walk away from the laptop because, it's don't touch it, you make it worse. So yes, you get to something that could also possibly look like this. If you don't want to make a bunch of flags, if you want to do just callbacks within callbacks, you could begin to scale them, right? Hey, I have a 32-inch monitor. I can tab all the way to New Orleans and back and not have a problem at all. This leads to what people call callback hell, right? 5 or 6 years ago, everybody was talking about how bad callback hell was. And I'm sitting here in the corner thinking, okay, sure, but yeah, typically I have 2 things. Yes, there are times when I may need 4 things, but a lot of times I'm doing 2. And I'm kind of okay with a double nest. It's not the end of the world. But just so you know, a lot of people were really worried about callback hell. If your code is working and you are doing 1 thing, 2 things, maybe even 3, and you're happy with it, I say keep being happy. You could tab 3 times. Nothing's going to break, hopefully. But you can look at that code and think to yourself, possibly we can make this a little bit more organized, hopefully maybe a little bit easier to work with. And that's where our second, much more advanced solution, definitely at the end. We're not going anywhere past it. This is the end solution. We won't add any more features. And that would be promises. Before I go any further, any questions about callbacks? Have people been using them? Feel pretty comfortable with them, seeing them around? Node.js especially. In fact, it feels like in my experience, I saw it a lot more in server-side code than I did in client-side code. But it's definitely, it's something that has been around for a while. In fact, the Adobe PDF APIs that I'm talking about later make use of callbacks. And I'll talk a bit about how I got around that, made it a bit fancier to pretend that I'm clever. So a promise is simply an object that represents some abstract async code process going on. This is essentially the same thing as having a personal assistant. So I need to get cats. I need to make a network request. I need to hit a database. That particular operation, I want to set somebody up, and their sole job is to just let me know when things are done. And I could tell that assistant, hey, when you are done, when that process is done, I want you to do A, B, and C. Promises understand 3 different states of being, basically the state of the process, either pending, so still working, fulfilled, I got a response back and I'm happy, or rejected, something went wrong. You can also take these processes and then kind of chain them together to handle those scenarios that I was talking about where I need to do A, and then I need to do B, I need to do C. So a new version of this could look something like this. So I've rewritten getCats now to return a promise. So instead of having an undefined result, I have something back. I have cat promise. That is not the result. That is the personal assistant. I have seen a lot of people make use of the pizza ordering scenario as a way of describing asynchronicity. So if I order pizza and that takes 20, 30 minutes, what I get back is a personal assistant whose sole job is to say, Ray, your pizza's not here yet. We're working on it. Ray, pizza's here now. Now we could do something with that. Within a promise object, you have the ability to supply a function via the then method that basically says, when you are done, this is what I want you to do. Very cool thing about promises is that in this particular code sample, it's immediately after. I do cat promise equals some function, and then cat promise dot then, do whatever. That could actually be a billion lines later. Promises are very cool. If I go to a promise and say, hey, when you're done, I want you to do blah, blah. If the process is already done, the promise is fine with that. It's like, okay, yeah, no problem. I'll do it when it's done. Hey, by the way, it's done. Here's, what you want. So you can actually do this multiple times. You could do it at any point at all. And again, it will handle recognizing when something is done and just automatically running it. If your particular process were to throw an error, you kind of have 2 ways of handling it. You could either use a catch handler, or the then function actually allows you to listen for both the success and the error handler. I typically use this format. This is the one that's just more comfortable for me. But then this is how I would handle any type of error and then go from that based on whatever my logic could be. So I will again open this up over here. All right, so I have a cat promise equals get cats. And then when I'm done, I'm displaying the result. And then for the heck of it, I wrote a call that would throw an error. So in this case, I have the same logic, cat promise dot then, but this time I added a catch. In theory, you should always error handling. Everybody here, we always do error handling for all our code, 100%, right? Cool. I figure if we all lie to ourselves, it's a little better, right? That's a little easier. So all I did was define get cats a bit lower. If you look at this code pen later and you're wondering why all these spaces, it's only because I wanted to show you creating a promise a little bit later in the slide deck. But if you want to see the full code, just scroll down. That was a very lame trick, but I'm going to go with it. Any questions on that? So one more example. Let me open this up over here. And I really wish CodePen would remember. If I wanted to do an example with 2 functions that return promises, I have a getCats. I call that in my then. So essentially I'm saying, hey, when you're done, this is what I want you to do. I told that I want you to save the result, and then I want you to go ahead and call another function that returns a promise. I return that, which allows me then to chain and do then again. And that function worked. So this is kind of like the callback hell, where I had, hey, cats, when done, do this, and get dogs, and when done, do both of these. But it's not tab, so that makes it better. No, I was a little bit sarcastic. I personally do find this a little bit easier to debug mentally in my head. I do see a flow. I'm doing my first call. When I'm done, I'm doing my second call. When that is done, I can then say, hey, I have everything I need, and then I could render into the DOM or do whatever makes sense. If you need to do a lot of things, more than 2, you can actually use a method called promise.all. It lets you send any number of promises, and then it will fire when all of them are done successfully. I could not cap that enough, because a drawback to this particular one is that if anything goes wrong, it will throw an error. And basically everything just kind of dies at that point. It is essentially an all or nothing. You're going to hope that everything works out for the best. There's better ways. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But as an example, and again, I'll open this up in the bigger tab. This time I took that cat call, I took that dog call. Both of those returned to promise. So I could then use promise.all, pass in an array of promises, and then when done, work with it. When you use promise.all, it will send you an array of results where the first item in the array matches to the first promise that you sent. So you have to kind of mentally keep in mind, in my particular example, I knew that cats were first and dogs were first. Obviously, that's not always going to be so simple. It may not matter. Let's say you are loading 10 RSS feeds. You don't really care about the order. You have 10 sets of parsed RSS data there, so you don't really care that the first one was Raymond's blog versus somebody else, because that data is actually in the result set. If you do care about the order and need to know what was what and the result doesn't have it, then you have to find another way to kind of stuff that data in there. You need to find a way to keep in mind what was my input array so that I could refer to it when going over it. If that did not make sense, definitely see me later. I can show an example of that. But again, in this case, I knew cats were first, dogs were second. Oops. And I could then just work with it. I didn't have to make the variables on line 9 and 10, but I wanted to make life easier for y'all, and I wanted to make life easier for me and remember exactly what I was working with. Does this make sense? One thing to keep in mind, you see I am using the capital P promise, so I'm using like the core promise object.all, not a promise instance. So far, I've kind of hidden away from you how to create your own promises, because a lot of times you may be working with an SDK of some sort that tells you it's returning a promise and you don't have to worry about it. You may need to actually create your own promises. So I keep mentioning our own PDF APIs. We don't return promises. So when I use our code, I typically create my own promise with that to make it a bit easier to use in the rest of my code. To make a new promise, you start with new promise. You will pass in there a function that takes 2 arguments, resolve and reject. Those arguments are actually functions that you will use to return data. It's almost like I have sent you a self-addressed stamped envelope. Remember when we used to mail things via snail mail? I'm giving you an envelope. I'm giving you a good envelope and a bad envelope. And when your crap is done and everything was good, you'll use the good envelope to return that data back to me. If something went wrong, you could use the bad envelope instead to return to me. If you do not like fat arrow functions, that is okay. You absolutely do not have to use fat arrow functions. I am very comfortable with them. It took me a long long time to get familiar with them. You do not have to use that when working with promises. Who here has adopted fat arrow functions? Cool. Who here got them like immediately? Liars. No, I am extremely slow, and that's okay. I'm fine with that. All right, so a more concrete example of creating your own promise. Again, I use the new promise constructor. I am given that resolve and that reject object. I then do whatever my particular logic is, and then if things turned out okay, I use that self-addressed stamped envelope, that resolve function. I just basically pass the data in that I want to send back. And if something went wrong, I use the other one. I use reject. Now, when you use that depends on your business logic. So in my earlier code pins for get cats, I had logic where if I passed trash for a breed, that was an error. That was very customized, very personal logic. Your logic will depend on whatever that is you're building and what makes sense for you. So as an example of this, and this is basically the functions that I was hiding from y'all before, where basically for get cats, I am returning that promise. I have a little bit of business logic in there. Again, I'm looking for that trash breed, and that's going to be a problem. If I don't send that, I resolve my result. If it was a bad breed, I send out the error. And get dogs is the exact same. Does that make sense so far? Very cool way to make use of this is to fix older APIs. So the geolocation API, it has been in browsers forever, pretty much. Not really forever, but for a very, very long time. It's not a promise-based API. It looks a bit like this. It kind of has a callback functionality, but you actually send two functions, not one. First function is the success function. The second one is the error function. And the third one is the options. So for geolocation, it's stuff like high accuracy, how often to update, and fun stuff like that. So this is baked into browsers. This is not ever going to change. It is what it is. But typically when I use this, I take that baby and I just wrap that in a new promise. And then inside my success function, I use the resolve from the promise, and in the error, I use a reject. And now I could do something like, get location modern, get that promise, and do .then work with the result. This is pretty much exactly what I did for the Adobe PDF APIs to give me a nicer way to work with them. So as an example of that, and yes, I love doing this. If you follow me on Twitter, you saw I tweeted about this. I love to leave notes for myself because I will absolutely forget on stage. But there's my location. There's a map. And we are in Atlanta, although, there we go, outside of Atlanta. This is the wrapped geolocation call that I showed on the slide earlier. A little bit more concrete, a little bit more compact, just so I feel fancy. But what I like is, like back in my calling code, it's literally get location.then. So I've kind of wrapped the API. I've actually made it a little bit easier for me to use as well. If you want, right here, instead of resolving the complete result from geolocation, which is coordinates, and then also I think some timing, I don't know, it's crap I don't use. So I pretend it's not there. I just return only the coordinates because that's all I'm actually working with. Back up here in my calling code, I call to get location, and then my result will be just that simple coordinate data. Does that make sense? Cool. Some more fun stuff that you could use of goodies, and I kind of hinted at this a little bit earlier when I mentioned that promise at all was kind of an all or nothing type thing. There is a all settled, any, race, and finally. So I'll do any and race first. So promise.any gives you the support for, I'm going to do 10 things. I don't care who finishes. First one that finishes, I want to know about. And it's going to be the first successful one. Promise.race is, I'm going to do 10 things or more. The first time anything happens, good or bad, let me know. All right. Promise.allSettle will allow me to say, I want to do 10 or more things. And if anything goes wrong, that's okay. When they're all done, give me end results back. And then for each one, I can check to see this was good, this was bad. So essentially, depending on what your logic is, whether you care about errors, whether you want to stop on an error, whether you're fine with a couple of errors in there, you have these methods in there. Finally is essentially a way to say, hey, you know what? I want support for something good happen, then. Something bad happen, catch. If either of those happen, at the end of that process, I want to say, hey, finally, let's do this. So as an example of using promises, some of the more modern browser APIs, and Fetch, I'm calling it modern, but it's like probably 4 or 5 years old now. This newer browser API actually was built to return a promise. So I can write a function called getStarWarsFilm, and I could just return the result of using Fetch. If for some reason you are not using Fetch for network calls, it is the modern way of doing Ajax. It's a heck of a lot better than a native XML, HTTP, blah, blah, I don't care. It's a very, very nice API. And all I've done is wrap that into function, so I can call it and do .then. One of the ways that Fetch works is that it gives you a result object. If you want the data from that, that also returns a promise. So I said, take the result and give me the JSON data, which returns a promise. So finally, over here, I can then start iterating over that data. A slightly nicer way, as long as I'm wrapping stuff, instead of returning the fetch by itself, I let fetch run. And because I knew that my API returned JSON, I just did that. I hid it away in the function. Because I knew this particular API, in its result structure, it has a .results, which is actually the array of data I care about. It has pagination stuff as well, but I really just care about my array of data. I essentially rewrote that function to kind of hide away those details from me. So back here, I just call getStarWarsFilms2 and then work with an array of results. So I will use promises not only to kind of fix older APIs, but also to wrap and massage stuff that I want in a format that is a bit easier to use. And finally, even nicer, is that you are allowed to work with static data. Resolve doesn't care what you pass it. So if I'm working with a new API that doesn't exist yet, and I want to make sure I write it in a way that will support an asynchronous process later, you can absolutely create a promise that just returns static data. Nice thing about this, so back up here, I have my code, I'm calling it, I'm iterating. If the API that I was waiting for, when it comes up and actually starts working, I just fix the function and everything else works. In the past, I may have built something static and not returned a promise, and I have to go back to my code and do a callback and do all that jazz. Now, this is kind of future-proof that I don't have to think about it. So some more resources. Obviously, if you are a web developer and not using MDN, please start using MDN. There's documentation about the API, and I thought I had one more link there, but that is okay. All right, the third and final solution, this is the new hotness. Nothing will ever replace this. Raymond said in November of 2021, even though I've been in this business for 30 years, Yes, something will change this in like 4 or 5 years because that's just the way we roll. Async await. So this was introduced in ES8, ES 2017 because people hate to name things. It's been out for a couple years now. What year is this? 2021. Time has been really weird the last couple of years. Supported in Node way back in October 2017. Very well supported. Another resource as a web developer you must know is caniuse.com. Look at all that green. It's even supported in IE6. Yes, I'm calling Safari on iOS the new IE6. It even works there. And frankly, I'm happy when anything works on that particular darn browser. This is not a replacement for promises, but more of an enhancement. And hopefully when you see some of the code working, that will make a bit more sense. I'll be honest, I'm the speaker. I'm supposed to be infallible, right? No, it's very likely I may screw something up. If so, I apologize. I'm learning, I'm sharing. I feel like I have a decent grasp on this. I'm using it in my day-to-day code, probably not screwing up too badly. If I do make any mistakes, I apologize. So why do we have new stuff outside of always needing to have new stuff? It does get rid of a lot of then chaining, then hell. I'm not really sure that's a thing. I saw one blog post on it, so it must be a thing, right? And it lets you write async code like it was sync. That's really, really cool, I think. It is possible to kind of screw things up. That could be a bit of a foot gun, but it's a cool foot gun, so why not use it, right? As an example, this is a typical promise-based thing where I need to get a user. And then after I have the user, I need to get the orders for the user. And then once I have their orders, I can do blah, 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 do whatever I want. That, I feel, my brain can look at that and follow that, those lines, and I get it. This is even easier. Give me a darn user. Give me their orders. This is written like everything was synchronous with a little bit of syntax sugar to kind of flag that it's not actually synchronous. So what you will do to make use of this, or if you see code that is making use of this, there's a keyword that you can now put in front of the function keyword, async, and it kind of marks the function as being asynchronous. It will make the function return a promise even if it doesn't. I think you should always return a promise just to be consistent, but it will kind of force a result into a promise if not. On the calling side, you will have another new keyword, await, that basically says, I want to know when that function is done. If you use await, it itself must be within an async function. And you kind of like, I know I did. When I was first playing with this, it was kind of a chicken and egg thing. So way down here, I wanted to use this new hot cool thing, but then the calling function needed to be async. Then that function needed to be async. It got a little bit difficult, but it wasn't too bad. So you take function foo that returns a hard-coded value 1, you add async, and then at this point, it no longer returns 1. It returns a promise. And if you look at the then handler, if you add a then handler to that result, the result that you will get will be 1. Here's a real example of this using a promise. This is typically how I would do it. I would have whatever slow process I would have. At the end, I would resolve with the async keyword in front. That's kind of the easy part. So literally just writing async in front does have to work. To use it, you have to use await. And like me, you may write something like this, async function whatever, let result equals await foo, and then you will get this lovely error that says await is only valid in async functions itself. So then I have to go back and kind of rewrite stuff. So the simple solution is to add async to the calling function. How simple that is depends on how deeply chained you are. So in my function level 5, that was called by 4, called by 3, called by 2, called by 1. Hopefully not. As a real example of this, I've added an event listener for DOM content loaded. It's running a function called init, and I marked init as async. This was really hard for me because in my mind, init wasn't asynchronous. Init's going to call a function called get Star Wars film. That's asynchronous. Like that made sense to me. Init was just doing something asynchronous. But in order for this all to work, I had to flag that as well as init. In this particular simple use case, this is kind of like the top level function. So this is it. Once I add async there, I can on line 5 call my asynchronous function like it was synchronous. I do a loading message, do my async crap, and then start working with it. This function down here is literally the same as it was before. Only change was to put async in front. So this part here, maybe it's just me, but that just took me forever. That was a huge mental stumbling block to get that through my thick skull. Once I did it a couple of times, it began to feel a bit more natural. Just expect that you may struggle with that as well. As a more advanced example of where this really begins to rock, I could do 2 calls. I'm calling get Star Wars ships and calling get Star Wars film. But if you look at this function, this looks like a very synchronous function. I'm doing multiple async things in here. I'm treating it like it's all synchronous code. Get my Star Wars ships, write out my DOM. Get my Star Wars films, write out my DOM. And again, these are all just kind of regular promise/fetch type calls with the async keyword in front. Another example, if I wanted to write them a little bit tighter, I can get fancy and run them at the same time. This time I'm using promise.all because the result of an async function is a promise, which means I could use promise methods like promise.all. I passed in calls to get Star Wars ships, get Star Wars film. That's all within an array. And when this is done, they will fire at the same time. So this will be 2% faster probably than my last code. When they are all done, I could then work with the results. And this, again, if you don't recognize this, I believe the fancy name for this is argument destructuring or something destructuring. Basically, I got an array back, and I'm able to assign variable names to the first and second item of the array to make it a little bit easier to use. So instead of result bracket 0 and result bracket 1, I have assigned variable names to it. Some more fun stuff that you can do. Looping is really fun using async away. And like when I say fun, it's like the fun like when I bring my kids to the dentist. I have 8 kids. So I want you to imagine like 8 kids at the dentist. It's that level of fun. It's basically, for loops are okay. For each is not because the callbacks in there are not promises. Map is probably not going to work the way that you want to. I'm going to recommend that you do what I do. I use a simple for loop. It's old school. For let I equal 0, I less than blah, blah, blah. If I do anything fancy, there is an excellent blog post that I have linked to where the writer goes very deep into every single different way of looping. For A of B will also work correctly as well. And I know that I'm giving kind of a very high-level quick summary of that. Just in your mind, remember Ray said this is going to be trouble. And so I need to keep that in mind when I work with it. As an example of that, I got a little bit fancy. I updated my get Star Wars ships function to allow searching. And I want to search for multiple things. I want to search for wing. I want to search for destroyer. And basically, I want to fire off those search requests all at once. So I created an empty array. I looped over my input array and made an array of promises. And then I worked with the result by using promise.all and await. And that let me then essentially go over every item. Again, there's going to be different ways of handling this. Some more tips to leave you with. If you like working with callbacks, if your particular SDK, like our SDK, is using callbacks and you're fine with that, never let anybody make you feel like you're wrong for that. Use what makes sense. Obviously, if you're applying for a job, then I can't say that because people will look for certain things. I am well aware of not doing what people were looking for in a coding interview. But I'm a huge believer in talking with your team, figuring out a style that makes sense for y'all and that makes y'all successful, and keep doing that. Keep being successful with the tools that make sense for you. Start slow. I use arrow functions here as an example. They were out for probably a good year or two, and I hated them. My brain would look at that code and just immediately stop. And I would have to sit there and kind of recompile the code in my brain. And it took me about 5 times as long to read fat arrow-based code versus regular code because it was that radical of a change for me. Now, a couple years later, it flows naturally. When I read code that uses it, I don't have that mental break. But again, start slow. Don't try to do everything at once. As a concrete example of that, this is not a joke on a slide. Multiple hours on code that was not working. And literally, my coworker came up to me and said, "Hey, why don't you scroll down a little bit in your editor?" And I did, and I saw the issue. So yeah, that's why, it's another reason why I don't pass those coding interviews. So some links, Dr., I'm going to butcher his last name, Rochmeyer, Alex, his first name's a lot easier to say. He is easily the world's expert on JavaScript, and he has written incredibly deep, detailed blog posts on every single aspect. I absolutely recommend everything he writes. He is a good writer. It does get very deep, so it's the kind of thing that you don't want to be looking at while you're also in a boring meeting. You want to give it your full attention because you will need to do so. Once again, MDN has great tutorials. MDN is absolutely not just a reference. They also have good guides and good examples, good things to help you learn, not just the reference material behind it. All of my code pins are linked to from the slide deck. And with that, I will open up to any questions. Before you ask something, by the way, I really appreciate y'all showing up. I appreciate y'all risking your health a bit to come here. I appreciate your attention and y'all just being here. So thank you all very much. All right. Yes. You need to come a little bit closer for me. I'm a little bit hard to hear. Or take the mask down for a second.
What API did you use for the map generator?
Oh, so his question was, what did I use for that quick map that I showed on screen there? Not Google Maps. My last job was for a company called Here, which was real fun. Like, hey, where do you work? I work at Here. Where? Here. Yeah, so Here's a mapping company. They have APIs that do mapping stuff. Anybody else? Well, if not, I will see y'all hopefully later today at my super exciting PDF presentation. Have a good rest of the conference.